do this. 50.
All right, let's get this show on the road. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for those who've come to join us today in the audience. This is a work session looking at the issue of accessory dwelling units. This is a part of our affordable housing portfolio of items and tools that we use to try to extend and expand the opportunities in the county for people to live at low and moderate income and to in fact stay in their own homes with some additional financial support. It's an ordinance that's been in place for some years, and it was time, I think we all felt, to revisit the ordinance to find out how we could improve it, make it more usable, more effective, after being able to look at how it had worked over the first years. And I think we all recognize that it was underutilized in the early years. Very few people actually took advantage of this ordinance, and the goal has been to assess it, understand it, and then make recommendations to amend the ordinance to make it more usable. So I think all of us have had some level of input or awareness of the task force and the work that's been done. So Alice Hogan, thank you for joining us on behalf of the community group and the task force that worked with staff. And we'll go through the agenda and then see if county board members have any questions on a number of the particular elements where recommended changes are being recommended. So, Mr. Manager, let me turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll go right into it. Joel Franklin's going to make the presentation, and we have other housing staff available.
Great, thank you very much. As you mentioned, the agenda for today, staff will go through a presentation, and then we are looking for feedback on the key elements of the proposed recommendations. These include detached accessory dwellings, maximum occupancy, minimum lot width requirements, time requirement for owner occupancy, and an annual countywide limit. We will then go through next steps on where we go from here. The presentation outline has four main components that include background on the current ordinance and process, best practices from other jurisdictions, recommendations on detached accessory dwellings, size and occupancy, design requirements, compliance and parking, and again, the annual countywide limit. And then we'll end with next steps. The Affordable Housing Master Plan was adopted in 2015. The plan was developed as the county's long-range vision for addressing housing needs in the county and identified accessory dwellings as an existing tool to provide an adequate supply of housing, help older adults age in place, provide a typically lower-priced housing alternative, and enable homeowners to receive additional income. The plan recommended review of the ordinance to encourage greater use, and the board directed staff to look into accessory dwelling adjustments as one of the priority items in implementing the plan. The Affordable Housing Master Plan indicates that older adults households are expected to grow 3 times faster than other households, and according to a survey conducted during the development of the plan, many older adults want to remain in Arlington but worry about rising housing costs. The average age of the homeowner creating an accessory dwelling in Arlington is 55, indicating that they may be creating the unit to help age in place. Additionally, the Housing Master Plan highlighted a sharp decline in the number of market affordable units and noted a need for approximately 7,000 affordable units. The average rent that is being reported that's charged for an accessory dwelling in Arlington is $1,000, which is actually below 60% of the area median income for a one-bedroom unit. Accessory dwellings won't solve the housing affordability issue, but as the plan notes, it's another tool. So the major goals for revising the ordinance were to make it easier for residents to add accessory dwellings while maintaining the residential neighborhood character. We prioritize these 2 items while making our recommendation. So what is an accessory dwelling? Currently in Arlington, an accessory dwelling is an independent dwelling unit that has its own kitchen and bath, is within a single-family detached house, is occupied by no more than 2 persons, and has a separate entrance. The accessory dwelling unit must meet building code for fire separation, fire egress, and separate heating and air handling. Accessory dwellings are currently allowed in all R districts and one-family detached dwellings. The yellow on the map indicates where R districts are located in the county. A couple other items that are allowed in the zoning ordinance are family caregiver suites and the recently adopted short-term residential rental ordinance. An accessory dwelling is different than a family caregiver suite, and in that an accessory dwelling is a separate dwelling unit, whereas a family caregiver suite must have interior access to the rest of the dwelling and can only be occupied by 2 persons who are either related by blood, marriage, adoption, or foster care, or if they are providing on-site care. A short-term residential rental allows residents to rent out their primary residence for stays of less than 30 days, whereas an accessory dwelling does allow for long-term occupancy. A little history, the accessory dwelling ordinance was implemented in 2009, and only 20 have been approved since. Regulations were restrictive due to community concerns about overcrowding and changing the character of the single-family neighborhood. The map on the next slide shows the location of the 20 approved accessory dwellings. As you can see, there are accessory dwellings in East Falls Church, Waycroft Woodland, Lion Park, Barcroft, Aurora Highlands, and elsewhere. The chart shows the number approved per year. We are averaging between 2 and 3 accessory dwellings per year, with a high of 6 units in 2015. So the process to date, a working group was created to advise staff on what changes need to be made to the accessory dwelling regulations in order to encourage greater usage while preserving the character of Arlington single-family neighborhoods. The working group was made up of members of the Housing Commission, 2 members of the Commission on Aging, a member of the Civic Federation, and a member of the Alliance for Housing Solutions. We looked at other jurisdictions. We heard from applicants that were both successful and from those who were not able to create an accessory dwelling. We reviewed the current regulations and examined ordinance provisions that may limit usage. And from there, we identified preliminary ideas for community discussion. Community engagement. Community engagement kicked off in the fall of 2016 with a Missing Middle Design Gallery that was co-hosted with the Alliance for Housing Solutions. This gallery started a conversation with the community regarding detached accessory dwellings. For Affordable Housing Month in October, staff developed educational materials that included a website, frequently asked questions, and posters. These materials provided education on what currently is allowed, what has been produced, and what are some of the issues that have been identified. Staff had a booth at the Arlington Home Show and Expo in April of 2017 that also educated attendees on what is currently allowed and sought input on those issues identified. Community forum was held in May, where staff shared preliminary ideas for discussion on options for improving the accessory dwelling regulations. Community members had an opportunity to have small group discussions on the topics of size and occupancy, design guidelines, parking, and compliance and parking, and detached accessory dwellings. The input from all of these engagements aided staff in developing the preliminary recommendations that will be shown today. A community survey of those draft recommendations just closed, and we will have those results compiled and posted soon. We do have some preliminary results from them. So best practices, we looked at other jurisdictions who allowed accessory dwellings, including locally Fairfax County, Montgomery County, and DC, as well as those that are considered best practices across the country, such as Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, and Santa Cruz, California. Many communities are doing what we are doing now, which is revisiting the ordinance. The communities are looking at allowing for larger accessory dwellings, and some are looking at allowing for greater occupancy, and many allow for detached accessory dwellings. Some jurisdictions do not currently allow accessory dwellings, such as the city of Alexandria. Locally, Fairfax, Montgomery, and DC all allow accessory dwellings, and all 3 allow for detached accessory dwellings. For the size, an accessory dwelling in Fairfax and DC cannot exceed 35% of the gross floor area, and Montgomery has a max cap of 1,200 square feet. All require owner occupancy, meaning that the owner has to live in either the main or the accessory dwelling. Fairfax has a maximum occupancy of 2 persons. Montgomery follows the building code but has a max of 2 adults, and DC allows for 3 persons. Just a little look at the comparison of installation rates to see how some of the best practices are doing. In 2009, Portland was issuing about 27 permits for new accessory dwellings. In 2010, the accessory dwelling production more than tripled when they waived what's called their system development charges. These charges cover impacts on roads, sewer, parks, and utilities, and are estimated around $17,000. So they saw a pretty big jump once they waived those charges. So Portland has approximately 150,000 single-family houses for an installation rate of about 0.09% per year, which is about 135 accessory dwellings per year. So they're producing probably the largest gross amount of accessory dwellings. Seattle is kind of interesting case because they did not allow detached accessory dwellings until December of 2009. The next year that they did it, they had approximately 35 attached accessory dwellings and 15 detached. The following 3 years, they averaged about 31 detached accessory dwellings, and I believe they're currently about that same rate. So Seattle has approximately 130,000 single-family homes for installation rate of about 0.04, so that's about 50 per year they're doing. Santa Cruz is another example of best practices, and in the early 2000s, Santa Cruz expanded its original ordinance that had been in place since 1984. The update allowed for a greater number of residential zones to create accessory dwellings and waived permit fees if the homeowner committed to making the new unit affordable. In the 20 years before the update of the ordinance, they had approximately 120 accessory dwellings built. In the 10 years since, they've had over 220 built, with a peak of about 36 units constructed in 2007. They're averaging about 20,000 accessory dwellings per year. 20. And they have about 18,000 single-family homes, so they're a much smaller jurisdiction. Comparison, Arlington has averaged, I mentioned, about 2 to 3, about 3 accessory dwellings per year for installation rate of about 0.01%. So you remember the cap is 28 per year, so if we had met that cap, it would have been right on about par with the other jurisdictions, about 0.1%, or 28 units per 28,000 single-family homes. So just a little bit of comparison with what other jurisdictions are producing. A couple examples, just some illustrations of detached accessory dwellings. The upper right is a 1-bedroom, 500 square foot backyard bungalow in Santa Cruz, California. On the bottom is an accessory dwelling above a garage in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. So jump into the...
You were actually at that one. No,
David was.
David's actually been to that
David
one.
said he
knocked on
actually...
the door.
Trying to find the pictures on a different phone. Yes, I think if it's the one I'm thinking of, there's 2 habitat lots and they back to back and.
David, you have to put your microphone.
Sorry. I think they're both, I mean, the one on the photo, I think they're back-to-back Habitat for Humanity lots. So they've got, in this case, they've got the primary building is on the front, and that's in the backyard. And then the lot on the other side of that has a primary structure on the back end of the lot, and it's got the accessory dwelling on the front end. But this is an example of Santa Cruz.
So jumping into the proposed recommendation, the elements include, as I mentioned before, detached accessory dwellings, size and occupancy, design requirements, and compliance and parking. So starting off with detached accessory dwellings, currently they are not allowed. So homeowners are unable to convert an accessory building, such as a garage, into an accessory dwelling under the current provisions. The preliminary staff recommendation would be to allow an accessory dwelling in what you are already currently allowed to do for a 1 and 1.5 story accessory building. Those 1.5 story buildings can be up to a height of 25 feet. Setback requirements include for interior lots are 1 foot from the rear and side lot lines and 8 feet from the principal dwelling. Corner lot setbacks are a little greater at 25 feet from the corner street, 10 feet from the rear lot line, and 1 foot from the interior lot line. And they also have the same 8 feet from the principal dwelling. The footprint cap for R5 and R districts, which have smaller lot areas, is 560 square feet and 650 square feet in all other R districts. Detached accessory dwellings would be closer to neighbors than attached accessory dwellings, as accessory buildings would be allowed to be as close as 1 foot from the lot line. This is an illustration of the height restriction for a detached accessory dwelling. The 25 feet is measured from the midpoint of the roof to grade for 1.5 story. The next slide shows the possible placement of 2 accessory dwellings. Note the potential for them to be 1 foot from the lot line. The smaller accessory dwelling footprint is displayed on the lot on the left, which is depicting an R5 district, which has a minimum lot area of 5,000 square feet. And a larger accessory dwelling footprint on the RA district on the right. The one on the right is also depicting what would be an example of a corner lot, versus the one on the left would be an interior lot. Here is another illustration of the height, looking at it from the street view. The blue in the back of the house represents the maxed out height of 25 feet that you could do. We thought it was important to show you what the maximum of what is possible there. Moving on to maximum size requirements. Applicants for an accessory dwelling noted that if they have a larger basement footprint than 750 square feet, which is what's currently allowed, they would have to partition off part of that basement. So if you had an 850 square foot basement, then you would need to carve off about 100 square feet. So staff's preliminary recommendation is to increase the maximum square feet from 750 square feet to 1,000 in basements for accessory dwellings, and above a basement, it would remain at that 750 square feet. This wouldn't eliminate the problem, for example, if you had a 1,200 foot or a 1,200 square foot basement, you would have the same issue, but it does allow for a little bit more flexibility for you to use the full footprint of your house. A detached accessory dwelling would be limited to a maximum of 750 square feet as well. Occupancy requirements. Some applicants noted that they would like to rent out the accessory dwelling to a couple with a child, but the current occupancy limit of 2 does not allow that. So staff's preliminary recommendation is to allow up to a maximum of 3 persons. We also do note that limiting it to 2 occupancy does reinforce the accessory nature of the use. Second, currently the owner needs to either live in the main dwelling or in the accessory dwelling, and we are proposing that this remain part of the ordinance. However, we are proposing removing the requirement that the owner must live in the house for a year before getting approval for the accessory dwelling. This requirement can present challenges for new construction or new home buyers wanting to renovate before they move in. So also for home occupations, currently home occupations are allowed with permit, consistent with home occupation regulations for all dwellings, except contractor and service businesses are not currently allowed in accessory dwelling. The proposal would remove this restriction on contractors and service businesses as home occupations. This would make this consistent with home occupation requirements for all other dwellings in which home occupations are allowed with a permit. Design requirements. The current design guidelines do limit flexibility somewhat for configuring an accessory dwelling with an entrance on the side of the main house. Limitations on the location of the door and stairs do help to ensure that single-family dwellings continue to look like single-family dwellings and put requirements in place that maintain the single-family character. Currently, an accessory dwelling on a corner lot cannot have its entrance visible from the street, and staff is proposing to remove that requirement. Staff is also recommending a change where the main entrance and accessory dwelling entrance may be on the same side of the house as long as they are not facing the same direction. We have an illustration to show an example of that. And lastly, similarly, we're looking at removing the requirement that an accessory dwelling with an entrance above the first floor cannot have exterior stairs visible from the street. So the illustration, go too far, Jennifer? One more. There. Oh. So here is an example of where we're talking about what would be allowed under the current proposal is that you would be able to have your accessory dwelling on the front as long as it's not facing. The red in the illustration is representing doors. The front door there you can see, go back one, Jennifer, is you can see it's on the left, so it's kind of hidden on the side of the house. And the next one is what would not be allowed, so you're not going to be able to have two doors facing the street. Likewise, for the illustration on the location of exterior stairs, the one on the left is an interior lot, so you would not be able to put exterior stairs on the front of the house, but would be available on the sides and the rear. On the corner lot, you would not be able to have stairs on either side that is facing a street. So moving on to lot area and width requirements. Currently, the lot must meet the minimum area requirement of its zoning district, and staff is proposing to keep this requirement. We know approximately 20% of the single-family lots in Arlington County are non-conforming with respect to area. Also, currently, lots must have a minimum width of 50 feet to create an accessory dwelling, and staff is proposing to remove this requirement. The minimum width requirement could preclude lots in older neighborhoods which are narrower than is currently required. Approximately 10% of the single-family lots in Arlington do not have a width of 50 feet. There was an example of an applicant who did come in and was denied because they did not meet the 50-foot minimum width requirement, but did meet the area requirement. Approximately 60% of the lots that do not meet the 50-foot width requirement do have do meet the area requirement. And many of those that are 50 feet are just shy of the 50 feet, so there's a large percentage that are right around like 48, 49 feet. So they would not be eligible by the few feet. So, while lots with substandard widths would be subject to the same setback requirements as standard lots, removing the width requirement would allow accessory dwellings on narrower lots and would be closer to neighbors. Compliance requirements. Currently, the owner agrees to cooperate with code enforcement staff for annual inspections and complaints, and staff is not looking at any changes there. A covenant is recorded on the property when the accessory dwelling is created. This is important because it alerts a future buyer that there is an accessory dwelling on the property and they need to follow the regulations. We are recommending still requiring the deed covenant, but are looking at re-examining language that states specifically that this is an accessory use in a single-family dwelling. We have heard from one individual that banks may charge commercial rates rather than residential rates to single-family homeowners, reflecting the property as an investment property. The affidavit of compliance is currently required at initial occupancy and whenever new tenants move in. Staff is recommending requiring this at initial occupancy only, since it's not necessary every time a new tenant moves in, since they are certifying that they will comply with the regulations. It would be required for each new owner or when an owner made structural changes. There is currently a limit that only 28 accessory dwellings can be approved in a year. While zoning and code enforcement complaints have not been generated as a result of accessory dwellings created since 2009, and production of accessory dwellings has been minimal, regulations with more flexibility and more options may generate more accessory dwellings than were possible previously. Therefore, we are proposing to keep the annual limit and re-examine the ordinance in a couple of years. Parking requirements. Parking requirements have remained largely unchanged with some minor clarifications for intent. So if a property has one space, then one space shall be maintained. If a property has two spaces, then two spaces shall be maintained. If a property has no on-site parking spaces, then they need to create one on-site parking space, or they need to do a parking survey. If the parking survey determines that the block is less than 65% parked, then they will be able to create an accessory dwelling. Finally, staff is recommending removing the requirement that if there are 2 spaces that are not tandem, then those 2 non-tandem spaces be maintained. And what that means is, on the next slide, if you have, for example, 4 spaces, you're only required to maintain 2 of those. So you would either have the option 1 to maintain the 2 that are tandem, or option 2, the 2 that have access to the street. Under the current ordinance, you only have the ability to maintain option 2. So a little bit more flexibility on what you're able to maintain there. Next slide. Short-term residential rentals. On December 10th and January 28th of 2017, the board adopted new zoning ordinance regulations that define a short-term residential rental as a new home occupation called accessory homestay. The regulations affect short-term rentals through online services such as Airbnb and Craigslist. Currently, an accessory homestay is allowed in an attached accessory dwelling. Staff is proposing to allow accessory homestay in a detached accessory building only when it has been approved as an accessory dwelling. So the next step, I had mentioned that we just closed a survey that we did on the draft recommendations. We are working to compile those results now, and then we will finalize our recommendations hopefully by the end of July. And then we will review those recommendations with ZOCO, which is the Zoning Commission of the Planning Commission. We have a scheduled meeting date there of July 31st. Then we will take it to the Housing Commission and other relevant commissions, such as the Commission on Aging in the fall, looking at September, October timeframe. And then we are looking at a request to advertise in October with county board consideration in November. So we are looking for input on the recommendations and specifically on the key elements of the proposed recommendations that had been highlighted earlier and are up on the screen. And
Okay.
that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. I am going to turn just to see if the chair of the working group that worked side by side with you had anything she wanted to offer. And of course, as we start working through the questions, they can be directed to Alice or anyone on staff as well. So Alice, is there anything you wanted to say as we launch into the discussion?
Just it's been a great process. We've had several meetings, and I feel like that we got good input from the different commissions and folks in the community who are interested, and we don't have any qualms. A few things have changed since our last meeting, and so I'll be curious to see the result of the survey. And we're meeting a couple more times, and I'll be curious to hear your opinions on things. But no, we're pretty well in line with staff recommendations at this time.
Do you have some of your work group members here with us today? If anyone that was on the work group, want to just raise your hand and let us thank you?
Just Ken today.
All right, just Ken. Ken, thanks. Familiar place for you to be, I'm sure, yeah. Thanks for coming back.
Other side of the table this time.
Coming back. Okay, colleagues, shall we work through first the 5 bullet points and then completely open it up to other things as well? Let's start with the detached. Staff are recommending that we change the ordinance to now permit detached accessory dwellings. Is there any questions, conversation about that issue? Mr. Dorsey?
I support the goal. Just a question about those detached units being listed as being limited to either 1.5 stories or 25 feet. Why not just feet? What's wrong with 2 stories if it fits within?
25 feet.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
I believe the 1.5 story, that's how the 25 feet, that's how it is calculated. Staff did not look at allowing for 2 stories. We thought that the impact would be a little less, just allowing for 1.5 stories.
Can somebody explain to us the difference between 1.5 and 2? Because I'm assuming the top floor is habitable. Is that-
We have Debbie Albert from zoning here.
All
or
right.
Planning.
We have that slide. So a half story is, this is actually the illustration used in the zoning ordinance to define a half story. And it has to do with the height of that knee wall, which is the 2 feet. You can see it's pointed out on the right. So that's sort of what gets you to the half story, and just also a little bit more background on the kind of dual height requirement. These regulations proposed for the detached accessory dwellings are consistent with the existing regulations for any detached accessory structure. Detached accessory building. So it's consistent if you already have a detached accessory building and it is meeting the current requirements, then, so it's just for consistency. So those are requirements that are already in the zoning ordinance. It's probably unlikely that in 1.5 stories you would get as high as 25 feet. Although, just because of the way the height is measured, it's an average of the 4 points on the perimeter. So if you have some topography on your lot, you might get there.
But back to Mr. Fazzette's question, so the height of the knee wall, as this illustration seems to indicate, could allow for that second story to be habitable for humans? Or that
Yes,
half story?
Yes, that's correct. And it's the same half-story requirement that if you add dormers onto your house, or if you build up on your main dwelling up as well, the half-story regulation applies there as well, in terms of how it's measured.
Thank you.
Could I follow up a little on this?
Consistent with the existing code, and right now, that could be a garage, could be an office in the backyard, for example.
Correct.
Yeah.
Leave it on.
Yeah, just leave it on. Mr. Fasette, I was going to say, could you, so we saw that pretty picture, I think, of a garage with a unit atop. It would fit, it'd be able to do that. I didn't know what the limitations meant for a unit over a garage, which I think might be a typical one that people would want to do.
Yeah, that's correct. So if you're typically you would be sort of adding dormers onto a pitched roof in order to get some interior living space.
So you
So
get,
that's
so it'd be
that's where
smaller
you
than
get your
it's
half
probably
story.
smaller than the surface area of the garage, but not by much, is that?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
So if I could just
Sure.
one
Mr.
more
Dorsey.
to this. So this is mostly from the context of existing accessory structures are built with this typical type of configuration. If someone were to build one from scratch, would they be building, if they wanted to build 2 habitable stories, would they be building, would their architect, would their engineer design something that had knee walls higher than 2 feet in order to meet any modern code standards or preferences? Would this, in other words, would this limit the ability for someone to do something that would otherwise fit our height requirement if they were doing something not as retrofitting a shed or a garage, but intending to erect an accessory dwelling from the start?
I don't think so. I mean, again, that half-story definition is used on main dwellings as well as on accessory buildings. And so it is, you can have a half-story on a main dwelling, and I don't think we've run into issues where people are unable to meet code meeting this definition of a half-story.
It's good enough for me.
Yep, and one more question, and I assume we do this, if we actually had 2 story, you could do a whole story, then you'd have these, it'd be really high and look really, I mean, it would be clearly, I mean, it wouldn't fit in as well. I'm assuming that's what part of the reason is we're
It
doing a
would
half
be-
story instead of a whole.
It would be more likely to be probably closer to 25 feet if you were allowed to do 2 full stories. Again, that is, if you're within 1 foot of the lot line, that is the current height requirement for any detached accessory building. I will add, though, that if you're more interior to the lot, and I can't remember, it's a larger setback. If you're more interior to the lot, you are allowed to have a taller building. However, for the accessory dwelling, staff has proposed to limit it to that smaller limit.
So you
Again,
could have
kind
a
of
taller-
reinforcing. Yeah, if you're farther away from the lot line, a detached accessory building is allowed to go taller.
So you could have a taller garage, but if you had a tall, I'm just trying to make sure, a taller garage, and if you wanted to convert that garage, that tall garage to an accessory dwelling unit, you couldn't because it would be too high if it was on the interior. Do you see what I'm saying?
That's correct. If your garage is already tall and you need all that space for your garage, you wouldn't be able to convert it. But again, that's consistent. We're not proposing to change the limits of attached accessory buildings generally.
Okay.
But it is true that if you had a detached garage that was more interior to the lot, and Mr. Love is giving me sign language that I can't read about how tall.
Is that 10 feet?
You're- 10 10 feet from the side and 15 feet from the main dwelling.
So just to follow, so might we, if we go through with this, and by the way, this is all great. I really appreciate the work, and I think it's a huge improvement. But if we went with this one, could we possibly have somebody come and say, they've got this house and the garage is out back and it's 2 stories and they want to convert it, and the only way they can convert it to an ADU is to take off the roof off the top and lower it down? Is that what would happen to them? Or am I maybe misunderstanding?
If they already have a 2-story building,
Yep.
they can either
They can go ahead and convert it?
They can
Okay,
either
that's what I was
convert
checking.
it, hopefully, if they have an existing 2-story building, it is in a location, it wouldn't, you're right, it wouldn't be allowed to be used as an accessory dwelling because these limitations are a maximum of 1.5 stories.
Maybe, and even just to broaden it, what happens if you have an accessory building that is too big? Is that what you're asking?
That's kind of what I'm
You'd like
asking.
to convert a garage or
And
something
it's fine now.
I mean, you're legally non-conforming.
No, not your main. You have an accessory, you have a garage, you have a very large
big
set.
garage.
And you'd like to use it now that it's possible, it's detached and can be used, but it is too large. Is there some way to only designate a portion of that accessory building for dwelling use?
As proposed, it would not be allowed to be used as an accessory dwelling.
So,
Can I just try to?
Certainly, it could be written that way.
I try to focus this. I think this is helpful in that it surfaced something, because I think Mr. Dorsey started the questions and trying to understand the difference between 1.5 and 2, and we thought what we were hearing was, it's consistent with the code, it's got to be 1.5. All these structures, et cetera, have to be 1.5. But then you mentioned that in certain instances, when it's more interior to the property, in fact, there's a different standard. So now the question is, if you're allowed to build that kind of a structure in certain places on your property, why would we restrict that allowable structure to also be used as an ADU, or at least some portion of it to be used as an ADU?
that's what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
Is there a reason? Did staff think about it? I mean, did this come up in the conversation at all?
No, it did not. I mean, we talked about the fact that it could be higher. I think we looked at the current regulations of the 25 feet and felt that that was appropriate.
Might I just, go ahead.
I would also just add that, one of the things that we're thinking about throughout in terms of thinking through kind of what tweaks we make to the adopted regulations is maintaining the accessory dwelling as an accessory use and reinforcing that accessory use, and kind of not getting to a point where we have kind of 2 dwellings on a lot. So that's something that we kept in mind throughout the process.
Might I ask that, looking at the board members here, I think what we don't want to do is see a situation where there's already such a structure and that it's like another one of these situations where in the past we wouldn't let you do it for the first year. Well, why not? Well, why not? On the other hand, we have to be careful that we don't want to incentivize the larger structures. So can we ask that staff, as you process this in the last couple of months, explore that question about how we might or might not adjust this, but not incentivizing the larger ADU detached? Fair enough?
Yeah.
And if there's a way to grandfather, for example, legally, please explore that. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think it's
summary?
mostly, you don't want to have, it's like there are 2 rules. The more we can make it all conforming, the better, that it's not different for all these different kinds of buildings. But I understand not wanting to incentivize totally.
I think that, going with what the existing structures framework was exactly the goal, is to try to not have a whole second set of heights and setbacks on that already exists, so we'll just try to fit into what is there. And I think to what extent we talked about that, I think you're mentioning about how we really want to preserve the community and not have 2 houses.
Exactly, which is what,
randomly in the
right.
neighborhood. So keeping that second one truly a secondary home, not equal to the first house is first. And also, as you said, you know, the likelihood of a two-story garage in someone's backyard in Arlington is very, very low. So if we did explore the grandfathering,
Trust me, they'll find us.
But I feel as though we've looked into this enough to know this, what we have will cover probably 95% or 98% or some such thing. So it would be the exception by far.
And I think that's what I was just going to append to what Mr. Fizzetta has just asked of stuff, which I think is exactly right, is to the extent you can give us some sense of scale. I imagine we have a bead on how many accessory buildings on single-family lots there are in Arlington County, roughly, right? So we have no idea. Because do you not need, you don't have to go through any sort of exception to create an accessory unit, or an accessory building? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there is some question of how large is the scale of this problem if we're talking one or two two-story garages versus dozens and dozens.
Quick question. When we're assessing a house, don't we look at whether or not it has a garage? I mean, probably somewhere we have the information? I don't know.
I'm not sure what information they use in terms of assessments. Even if they did know whether or not it had a garage, I'm not sure if they're noting whether it's a detached versus attached garage.
Okay.
And we can get to that.
Interesting,
Let's
yep.
put that on the, I think that's an interesting question. Let's put it at the end of it, once we get through these 5 elements. So just to sum it up, I think I don't hear any opposition to the overall proposal. It's just to flesh out this nuance of a question. Maximum occupancy.
Excuse me.
Yeah, John.
Thanks, Jay. So so on, as far as detached ADUs, let me just ask, in terms of the land disturbance, stormwater runoff dynamic, how does this come into play in terms of maintaining our environmental protocols for construction of a land-based ADU?
Sure. So you would still need to meet coverage requirements.
Pull that a little closer or speak up a little.
All right. So you would still need to meet coverage requirements. We did meet with our stormwater management team, and they said this would, based on the footprint, this would be unlikely to cause any additional requirements unless they put in a large, long driveway. And then it might trigger some additional stormwater requirements, but they said it was not an issue.
Okay, because of the size limitation that we're talking about?
Correct.
Okay.
John, can I just confirm too, is that bottom line, if you built a garage, a detached garage, all the same stormwater requirements are going to apply. So,
Okay, so no,
Same requirements.
Correct.
That's good.
okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
okay, so let's move on, thanks. Maximum occupancy. Proposal here is to go from 2 to 3. Any comments, questions?
So I'm wondering, would 4 be a problem? You can see a couple with a baby, and then she gets pregnant and has a baby, and all of a sudden they're 4 and they're kicked out. I don't know. So I'm just wondering if they're,
We
but
just
maybe we don't want to
asked-
do that, just asking thoughts.
Did you, what was the reason did you discuss 4?
Well, that's, there's a limit somewhere.
Absurdum.
I think, we did. I think what we struggled with was that an occupant is an occupant. We are not, going out there and monitoring if it's a kid or not. So it's possible that there could be 4 adults living there. So we are not.
So I'm sorry, do children not count as occupants? I'm sorry, they do?
They do, of
Okay.
course. But we're not saying that the third occupant or fourth occupant has to be under 18. So it's very possible that you could have then 4 adults living in the accessory dwelling.
And do we want to go there? 2 adults, no more than 2 adults and 2 children? I don't know. I don't know if we want to go there or
Well,
not.
I think the point is.
Maybe we try it for a while.
You can't, we'd have to be comfortable with any amount of adults. We can't distinguish between 2 adults and 2 children. So if
you
you're not
can't.
comfortable with 4 adults, then we can't
Why?
make a rule for 2 adults and 2 children.
Realize that.
And also, it's 750 square feet, so at some point, that's a lot of people in a small place.
I get it,
So-
okay.
Okay,
All right.
any other questions? Christian? Oh, sorry, Christian, then we'll go over to Katie.
Sure, yeah, I just want to drill down into this a little bit as well. It just seems that, and correct me if I'm misremembering what we did with accessory homestays, but I think with accessory homestays, we allowed the greater of 2 per bedroom, something along those lines and some other metric. So in an in a short-term homestay, you can have 2 occupants per bedroom. Yet here, we're capping the number of occupants in an ADU, even though it could be at 750 square feet, as it can be used as a short-term homestay, and it has a different occupancy requirement than the general short-term homestay ordinance, because at 750 square feet, that could clearly be a two-bedroom ADU, which would, under that ordinance, be allowed to have 4 people, but in this case, it would only be allowed to have 3. How would we deal with that?
So currently, as I mentioned, accessory dwellings are allowed to be used as short-term rentals. However, in the ordinance, it does say that you can only rent it to 2 people. So it's the same. So that's how we still limited for short-term rental. Debbie can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but so I think we, as staff, still want the accessory dwelling to be accessory to the main dwelling, and I think that's why we didn't see to increase it beyond the 3. Does that answer your question?
Not quite. If you could just maybe go slower. I haven't had my afternoon coffee yet,
All right.
Joel.
So the current ordinance for short-term residential rentals only allows you to rent out your accessory dwelling to 2 people, which is the cap for accessory dwellings. That was what was passed by the board.
In your house.
Yes.
Right.
So if you're renting out the accessory dwelling, you only get to rent it out what is currently allowed now, which is 2 people. So going forward, we would propose that the accessory dwelling, if the occupancy did increase to 3, that you'd only be able to rent the accessory dwelling out to 3 people as well.
Yeah, okay, I think I understand. I guess what I'm suggesting, we've got somewhat of a new scenario. I'm not saying we necessarily need to treat it differently. It's just incongruent at this point. If you were to rent out your whole house as a short-term homestay, you would be able to do a maximum of 2 per bedroom. So this is now becoming a separate
Correct.
house, if you will. It's going to be governed by different standards as if it were within an owner-occupied house. It's just a little different.
Well, it's both. It's the detached and attached, right? So the 3, going from 2 to 3 is both if it's a ADU within the structure of your home or if it's a detached, correct?
Sure, but I could certainly see a scenario where you would have an accessory dwelling that is detached from your house to, maybe focus that intensity there, and it's going to be different than if you were to rent out your entire house when you're taking a short break away. Hey, I'm not saying it's a fatal flaw. It's just I'm not sure it necessarily.
Actually, and I think, Mr. Dorsey, maybe the broader point, too, of what you're surfacing is that it introduces some inconsistency into our zoning ordinance about what we think is an appropriate amount of people to be in a bedroom, right? And if we think 2 people per bedroom is, up to 2 bedrooms is overcrowding in a detached or attached accessory dwelling, why do we not think that's the case for a short-term homestay in a main dwelling? So I don't know that we're going to resolve it here today, but I think you're right to surface that inconsistency, and we might want to do some more thinking about it.
And I would agree. I think the more we can be consistent, and I know there are reasons for being inconsistent sometimes, but it's a good point.
Let's go to John and then over to Debbie.
Yeah, it is an interesting conversation, and I don't mind continuing it, except I think, just the way people are, it's one thing to maybe stay 1 or 2 nights in a crowded hotel room when you're on vacation with the kids or with, relatives or friends or whatever. And it's another thing to have that crowded condition on a, monthly or
Our
longer-term
zoning ordinance
basis.
actually is presumably not designed to protect consumer preference. It's designed to protect the, sort of neighborhood character. And
I
for-
don't disagree, right, but my inclination is to stick with staff recommendation for 3, but, we're not making any final decisions today.
Debbie, you were going to add something?
Yeah, just in response to some of those comments, and I'm actually going to kind of reiterate Mr. Weisstat's point to some degree. The difference here is that with an accessory dwelling, we're really looking at residential occupancy, so permanent occupancy, and sort of thinking about sort of what's the impact on the neighborhood on a permanent basis, whereas with short-term rental, we're looking at transient occupancy, and it is sort of a different animal. Zoning ordinances treat those 2 things differently.
And I'll just say that's helpful And I'm probably comfortable sticking with 3. I mean, this isn't going to be forever, and I think this is going to be, there's a big change already, and it might, people might be more comfortable with 3 to start. So-
Actually, I would just say that from my own point of view, and again, looking at slide 15, where granted, this isn't a comprehensive look, but just to give some people on the board some level of comfort around this, to the degree you found anywhere that allowed 4 might be useful, because honestly, where it appears people gravitate is to 2 or 3, and I don't see this as a consistency issue so much as there are differences in the goal and expectations of an accessory dwelling unit and a homestay. So I would sort of feel that the 3 is a good way to inch up and see how that works, and it puts us at the high end compared to at least those you've identified.
If I could just to understand this a little bit more, you could create an accessory dwelling that becomes your mechanism for doing short-term rentals.
We're going to talk about that.
Correct.
Say it again. You can create an accessory dwelling.
For the purpose of being your opportunity for doing short-term homestays. So this conversation about permanent versus transient use is not necessarily preordained by what we do here. And I would also caution us to recognize most of the other jurisdictions that we're comparing ourselves to have those limits that were created well before short-term homestays became the norm. Ours is coming at a point where we're trying to marry what we've recently done with that versus a new effort here. So I'm not sure the comparison exactly is apples to apples. So I would just encourage staff to think about it some more, regardless of our particular comfort for 4 and 3, mostly through trying to communicate something clearly to people who are going to be sort of, dealing with this in real life, whether or not there's going to be a clear way for people to actually be able to follow the regulations, because it's clear what we intend and what we want, what we divine based on the different circumstances that we're putting out there.
Well, Mr. Fazette, I know we're going through these individual metrics, but I want to come back to that comment by Mr. Dorsey, because I have some questions on that when we get to that
I think
point.
we are talking about that right now, sure, yeah.
So the slide, the 1 or 2 slides that you had, Joel, was helpful, that attempted to distinguish among ADUs, short-term rentals, and caregiver suites. So they're all variations on a theme, but each of the 3 are intended for different purposes. They're permitted differently. So my first question is there's the regulatory question of how do we enforce all these, and how do we keep these individual schemes regulated? And then the other thing is the intention of the homeowner now and the intention of the prospective homeowner who's shopping for a house and who moves into the house, taking subject to an ADU or a caregiver suite or an accessory homestay. How is that person going to be refreshed and reminded what the regulatory protocol is for that particular accessory use? Let's say that you've got a home caregiver suite in your house, the aging relative passes away. There's going to be temptation on the part of some to try and convert that use to either an ADU or a homestay. And then you could have, a number of other permutations and combinations, because we're talking about 3 different things.
Sure. So for an accessory dwelling, anyway, there is the annual inspection, and I do have Robert Love here if you would care to answer part of this question. And the other thing I think that you had mentioned in one of your emails is, which is a very good idea, we did put together a comparison of what a family caregiver suite is versus an accessory dwelling versus short-term residential rental. We need to update that based on what we are proposing, and as well as what was adopted for short-term rental. And I think that will be a very helpful tool to place up on the website that helps people compare what the different requirements are of each proposal. As far as, I guess the other portion of your question was regarding enforcement of all these. I know code enforcement does do an annual inspection for accessory dwellings, and they look to make sure that they are meeting all the requirements there. For family caregiver suites, do you do anything?
Currently, we don't have any sort of annual inspection for that. As far as the short-term residential rentals, you obviously have to come in once a year to reapply, so that's how we have that on track on what exactly the use is. Then for the accessory dwelling units, we do have a yearly inspection that we go by, ensure that your numbers are the same, you haven't converted it away. And then actually, we've told people that if they, let's say they sell their property, they can just simply come in, they can let us know that, okay, we're going to keep this accessory dwelling unit, and then we'll change it over to their name, so we keep that current.
Has there been any consideration as to any sort of like notation in our property tax assessment records? For example, we've talked about,
Can we get to that? I'm sorry.
RPA notation or.
John, do you mind? I think that's a great question, but can we hold that? Because I think it's a good one to put at the other list at the end of
Because
this.
there's also the question about the deed recordation.
Right, and I'd tie that to that
Yeah,
because
no, that's
I
fine.
think we have some
guess we
good
were
questions
segueing
around
in-
that.
We were segueing into distinctions, so that's why I brought it up now, but that's fine, we can wait.
Hold on that one, but
So I-
just back to the 3 and
Maximum
4.
occupancy?
Yep.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask what we know about the student generation factors of accessory dwellings. We only have 20, so I assume we can't extrapolate any decent data, but from other jurisdictions, other cities?
We have not looked into that on other cities. We do know for Arlington County that they do indicate how many people they plan to rent the accessory dwelling to, and 60% said they did plan to rent to the maximum, which is 2. Another 40% said they were going to rent or plan to rent to 1 person. I mean, obviously that could change, but I mean, that's what we know so far, but that is a good point, and we could ask other jurisdictions if they have any data.
I'd love to know just a little more about it. I say that actually not thinking that that would be a disincentive to allow. Maybe, I know for some people, including myself, one of the appeals of this type of affordability or this type of housing form is that it introduces affordability into parts of the county, including school boundary areas where you don't often see market rate affordable. So I actually think it could potentially be a great thing to introduce into some of our neighborhoods, but we of course need to be prepared for it, right? And in the past, we've experienced student populations booms for which we were unprepared because of changing uses in single family neighborhoods. So any research you all can bring or do for us as we have that conversation, I think would be really productive.
Great. Libby?
My guess is that that's going to change over time, that it'll start out not, and over time, we'll probably have more children with them, but we'll find out. So I'm missing something. Explain to me why we should have different rules for what goes into a caregiver suite and what goes into an accessory dwelling unit. Why is it necessary to have different rules?
So the caregiver suite has a very intentional purpose for it. It is either you are, one, providing care to the primary residents, child care, elder care, or it's a relative. The accessory dwelling allows you to rent to basically whoever you want. And so they are intended for 2 different purposes.
I understand that. Why do those 2 different purposes require, so like a caregiver suite has to have an efficiency kitchen, but a accessory dwelling unit can have a full kitchen, right?
Correct.
So I'm just wondering why we wouldn't just make it one. You can use the accessory dwelling unit as a caregiver suite if you want, or the caregiver suite you've got, you can use an accessory dwelling unit if you want. I'm just wondering why, but I'm missing something, I'm sure, so.
The main difference is that a family caregiver suite is part of the primary residence, so you have that interior access, whereas an accessory dwelling is its own independent dwelling unit.
Okay,
And that's
got
the
it.
main difference.
That's the main
And
difference,
And there's separate building code that's required for that is fire separation, separate heating and air conditioning. So it has to meet higher standards than the family caregiver suite.
Okay, yeah.
Mr. Vicente?
So, but continuing Ms. Garvey's question, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, I guess, is your question. In other words, okay, we did that then, now we're doing this now. Do we want to reconsider that? Are there policy reasons why, rather than having those bright line distinctions, that maybe from a policy perspective, it's not needed? And that's probably a discussion for another day, and we'd probably want to, commune with our Commission on Aging and other folks in that regard. But I don't know, Ms. Hogan, was there any dialogue in the lead up to this where you really discussed that to any great degree, the distinction with home caregiver suites?
I think there is interest in trying to bring as many of these together to simplify all the different types that there are. And we understood that there were issues with zoning and issues in the Virginia statute that we're running up against. But that said, I think that the working group would like to follow up on that again with zoning and figure out exactly how close can we get to those regulations to help simplify our approach in Arlington. And I'm not sure that we're at that max right now. And so I know that some staff has talked with people in Richmond already looking to do that. And I don't know if we've actually, explored the maximum that we could. And so I think we should do that before we finalize this. But it sounds like at some point we're going to hit some Virginia level
Garvey?
Yeah, I just,
barriers.
every time we talk about this, I come up with my own situation. So my daughter has this house, we put an addition on it. The kitchen had to come out because it has to be efficient, so that she don't. I want to live with my daughter. That's my aging in place thing, is I'm going to go. But I want my own house part, and I want my own kitchen. But right now, I can't do that, right? Under what we have. I can't put another. Well, that's what I'm asking. Under this, will I be able to do that?
Caregiver suite, correct, it's an efficiency kitchen, but for an accessory dwelling, if you do the full accessory dwelling.
It's not,
that would-
it's accessory dwelling, but it's attached, totally attached. We just went over.
Still, you could still have access inside if you want it.
Yes.
So you could still have access between the
Needs to have
two.
a separate entrance and fire rating.
Okay, all right. We're going to have to make this clear as to what makes things what, because it seems.
The only
yeah,
thing,
thank you. I
I just
appreciate that.
want to try to tie this part up is, it seems to me this, what I don't want is this discussion of whether we should change the family caregiver suite ordinance to interfere with tying up the ADU ordinance. We can all decide if that deserves to be adjusted in the future, and it's a work plan issue, but it really, I think you were right, Mr. Vice, that it wasn't necessarily part of this conversation, but it might spawn another work effort down the road. We just went through the short-term homestay, and we didn't really have the discussion of how it should be consistent with the number of people in an ADU. We created 2 per bedroom or whatever you said, and that was quite inconsistent with an ADU because the product was inconsistent. It was a very different thing. So it's a little odd for me now to think that why we are trying to, make them all the same. I think, yes, we need to be able to communicate consistently or, create clearly about what one is, how it differs from another and their purpose and their requirements. But you register for each of them individually and separately in there. Now, the one thing Mr. Dorsey said is, yes, if you have a ADU, you can use it as a short-term homestay. But according to the code, you can only have 2 people in it, which is consistent with an ADU. And we're now exploring, saying now you can have 3 in it, or some may be looking at 4. So really the operative question right now is, I'm not hearing anyone having a problem with 3 as is proposed. The question is whether we want staff to further explore whether it should be more people, 4 adults, in an accessory dwelling, whether you're comfortable with that. I will say I'm not, but I'm curious if there are others that want more information about that.
So I don't want to belabor the whether this is similar to accessory or to short-term homestays or not, but what I would say is with short-term homestay, you can, for up to nearly 6 months out of a year, have 4 people in 2 bedrooms. And so again, what I was trying to articulate earlier.
6 people in 3.
You can have 6 people in 3 bedrooms. And so what I was trying to articulate earlier is it may not be the preference of the consumer, whether it is an Airbnb renter or someone renting your accessory dwelling as their permanent home. It may not be the preference to have that many people, but we made a determination that up to 4 adults in 2 bedrooms did not pose undue burden on the neighborhood.
Can't be the same people over 6 months, right? You have to change every month.
Well, maybe that makes it worse or better, right? But anyway, so I guess my point is, and so that's why I bring that up in terms of consistency, right? And so if we genuinely don't think that introducing that number of people into the neighborhood poses undue burdens to the neighbors, then we ought to be having that conversation in this context too. I think it might be interesting to see, you know, I'm sure some of the survey data indicates what attitudes are. I'm sure the working group could give us some feedback. If there's a real sense that, you know, 3 is an appropriate threshold, but 4 feels like too many to the neighborhoods, and here's why, and here are the concerns, and here are the parking concerns or the crowding issues, I'm interested to hear them. But I do think, you know, that's why, in my mind at least, those conversations are related.
So you'd like to see that conversation
would like to
extended
hear
for
more,
a
yeah.
couple months? And Ms. Garvey, that's what I'm looking at.
I'm just
Okay,
trying
I'm
to get
trying
my
to
head
just
around
get a
it.
sense of whether we want to give direction to have that further explored. We're not telling you which way to resolve it, but do some more work on it. Okay, Mr. Dorsey, yes, so that's 3. Okay, you and I are in the minority. Let's let it go.
So I'm in the minority plus, I guess I would say. In other words, I'd be very surprised if I could get from 3 to 4. I'm not necessarily advocating that we, you know, shut down any further conversation, but I'm very comfortable with leaving the limit at 3.
Yeah, and I would, but we do have 3 board members willing to have you do a little more work on it, so please do, and help us understand if there are clear distinctions or differences, or if this is done anywhere else, and what the pluses and minuses might be. So, okay.
Said, if I could just say, for our friends in the minority, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking at a higher standard. Staff could very well, upon further conversation, come up with a rational way of thinking, conveying, communicating, and conceptualizing all of this. It's just that we're going to take greater time to do that.
They've already said pretty much that 3 is what you're comfortable with, and I guess that's where
But I
the
think what
chair
Ms.
and I are.
If I could just, I think what Mr. Dorsey is saying, which is a bit where I am, I'm looking for a way to easily convey the reasons we're doing it and why, and have it make sense to the people that we serve. And at the moment, I'm having obviously a hard time doing that.
All right, let's go on to minimum lot width requirement. And this, I think what you're saying is you are removing the 50-foot minimum lot width requirement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Are there any questions about this one?
I have questions about the design requirements, and they are more appropriate in this subject item than any other, but I'm also happy to hold them to the end.
The design, what is it?
So if you look at its slides 26 through 28 about the placement of the doors, for example, entrances, stairs, et cetera, not
Okay.
explicitly about setbacks or lot size.
Oh, I see, I
Somewhat of a
see.
piece. What's
Yeah, okay, let's go ahead and tackle this at the same, tie it together, yep.
So my sort of feedback on balance is, at least from my perception, these feel awfully restrictive for requirements. And I wondered if there was any discussion of potentially creating design guidelines, but not requirements. You know, I think when we talk about, for example, setbacks, it's really clear to me why that would be required, right? That's a sort of a matter of use of the home and neighborhood boundaries. These feel almost a little more like aesthetics, and so I wondered if there was any, which, you know, suggested, to me at least, they might be considered guidelines rather than requirements. Any texture from the conversation about that you all might provide, or is that something we could do more thinking about together?
Could I add one part to her question, I think, if that's all right? I think it's
sure.
helpful. I think it's helpful. I
Okay.
think it is. So, for example, when you look on slide 27, you've got the 2 red doors there in the front, which frankly look better to me than the other way. And I could see a home built this way where that's a family room on the side, and that's where the kids come into the mudroom, and you've already got a house like that, and you want to do a conversion, and suddenly you have to move the door. Does it make sense to do that? Does that help? I hope that's helpful.
Well, and so I think the broader question stands, is it a matter of aesthetics, and therefore why require it?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, staff?
Sure. So as you remember, one of our goals going into this was maintain the character of the single-family neighborhood. So, you know, in the case of the 2 front doors, there was concern about, you know, creating a look of a duplex. We wanted to maintain that look of a single-family neighborhood. And it's hard to regulate design. I think we can, you know, that's why we put these regulations in place on what we're allowed to do things. It's harder to regulate a good taste, I guess.
But can we regulate, we probably can't, the look of a single-family neighborhood. In other words, we put that in design guidelines, and they have to come to us anyway, right? These won't come to the board. These won't.
Ms. Garvey, your suggestion on slide 25 is, I think, where this is
I
summarized.
was looking at 27, let me see, slide 25.
Looking at the words, in 25, the current is the second one down here. Entrance may not be on the same side of the house as the main entrance, right? And
they'd like to have it not facing the same direction, and I totally get it, but looking at the picture makes me think that, as I say, I could see a house currently single-family house designed exactly
What
like
you
that.
would be wanting to do is just say the main entrance and AD entrance may be on the same side of the house, period.
Oh, I think
Well,
actually what
I'm
I would like
thinking-
to
I'm-
see is
I'm
our
not
ordinance
sure.
be
I'm thinking
silent
about
in
it.
terms of these requirements. Is that what I'm asking is it possible for us to not legislate these requirements?
Just removing the current restriction.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, so, all right.
And
I
does
got
that
you.
make
Same
it too
idea.
likely that we're going to have something looking like a duplex that we don't want, that it's going to take away from the same? I mean, a lot of single-family homes have entrances on
I
the same
think the
side.
conversation during the work group sessions was really to loosen the current. So
Yeah.
we're considering what's in the proposed already a loosening. So it's interesting that you all want to take it even one step further, you know.
Well, it's
That
just
will be
looking
the
at it, it
risk
looks like a
and-
regular single-family house to me, which is maybe shows where I grew up in the Midwest.
Is there a regulation against two on the front now? Do you know?
Not prohibited, no.
For a single-family home to have two front doors like my house does, there's no, my house actually has two front doors because someone added an office to the left side years and years ago. We don't use it. It's actually caulked to provide some energy efficiency, so you do not open that door anymore. So it's true, but you don't come in and out that door. On the other hand, to the public, there are two front-facing doors, so.
So maybe that's something to look at and come back to. I mean, I'm just raising it, and I think Katie's suggestion is.
I mean,
not
I think to the extent I would like to maybe broaden this point a little bit beyond just the front door issue. To my point, I mean, you've presented slides to us that suggest the average rent charge for an AD in Arlington is $1,000. This is really a significant body of work. This is a use that I think we should be welcoming in our community while being, cognizant of impacts on neighborhoods and protecting and planning against them. And I would hate to lose this opportunity in any house or lot because somebody's front door is placed in the wrong place. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here. But we may feel differently as board members, but we are, intending to give some feedback and direction. To me, I think we could really err on the side of not loosening enough. And again, that's why I really draw a distinction between things that could be aesthetic versus things that have a real impact. I don't want to loosen this to the point where it's having unplanned impacts on people's neighborhood lives. But I don't want aesthetics to stand in the way of a use that I would like to see more of, is my broader point.
So let me just try to tie it up. I think the three of us are comfortable with doing some more work on this and considering removing that, unless I hear, are you guys okay with that?
Could I make one suggestion? I don't know if it's possible to legislate saying that clearly one main door, not, that there's not two main doors. I don't know if you can do that or not, but
How
just
you
throw
do
that.
that?
I don't know, architects do it.
What about the doors? It's sort of what I'm trying.
Oh, you just want to get away from the doors.
I just, if it's, what I would really like us to focus on is codifying protections of strong interests and not aesthetics, is my point. And
But
so
to protect
you
the
might feel
single,
differently
well,
about the
I think to protect the single family,
If only primary colors, if we could go ahead and put that in the zoning ordinance.
ladies and gentlemen, please. But I think the single-family, what we're trying to do is preserve the single-family neighborhood look and feel, and this is one way of perhaps getting at that. And I just will say that I support that goal. Excuse
One
me, Mr.
approach
Manager.
would be when we come back for a request to advertise broadly.
Yeah.
And then have this conversation then. And then if you get input that it's a bad idea to have 5 front doors or no limit on front doors, then legislate.
And I, though, Mark, that could well be what gets advertised, but it also is incumbent upon the group, to the degree they process more of these questions, we're asking them to think through that, because it may become your recommendation if there was no strong basis. So, John, you had something to add?
Yeah, just from my perspective, I'm actually comfortable with this staff recommendation about showing that illustration with, and holding the line and not having an ADU front door, just like I'm comfortable, frankly, with what you're proposing with respect to stairwells or exterior stairways. Because I think while absolutely the use is important, I think aesthetics are also important, and I think you've struck a good balance here, at least from my perspective.
Did anyone, while we try to tie this part of it up on slide 25, did anyone have a concern with the exterior stairs to a second story cannot be on the same side of the house that faces a street? And that's no change from the current, correct?
The change there is that you couldn't have it on a corner lot.
It was
You couldn't have
visible
it
before.
visible.
Right,
So
this
it made it
means you
very
can't-
hard to configure the stairs
Right,
and without
gotcha.
being able to see them from the street.
So as your picture showed, you can put them in different places just so they're not on the side of the building facing the street.
Correct.
Okay. No concerns on that. Let's go on to the next one then. The next issue here was, and we had no issue with minimum lot width changes proposed, and time requirement for owner occupancy. This one, I will say, is the biggest no-brainer of all of them, because we heard from several people over the years who said, why did you, when we were building a home or renovating a home, why did you not let us build an ADU into the house to start with and allow us to have a renter? And, for the life of me, I can't remember how or why that occurred, if it was just modeled off of other communities or we never focused on it, but it seems completely counterproductive. And it has been a major obstacle, or one of them, I sense, for going forward with ADUs in single-family homes. So this just removes that requirement to live there for a year before you actually can have an ADU.
I agree with
Everybody-
it, and not to take a long time with it, Mr. Facette, but why would that prevent, if you were building a house, why wouldn't you still build it and then just rent it out a year later?
I don't even know that you can build it. I think you can't build it. You have to build it, and then you have to build something and then finish it a year later. You actually can't build the ADU, as I understand it. But also, people want to move in, and they want to get some rent right away to be able to afford their mortgage or have an income stream.
But if you're building within your house, you can do that easily.
I'm not sure that's the case.
Complete the kitchen, right?
Yes, we actually heard from a person that was trying to do this, and it was quite difficult.
Very labor intensive.
So, because you can't actually complete it until you moved in, because you can't actually, do the stove. You don't have the permit for that until the year. So it would be unable to be completed until that 1 year
1 year
has passed.
timeline was
For a
up.
gas stove.
Correct, and
Or electric, I think.
Stove.
I don't know if Robert Love wants to add anything or not.
yeah.
Okay.
It was much more problematic and caused a lot of turmoil for a lot of people trying to design an ADU into their home, but leave it at that. Mr. Feist?
Yeah, I just, I think it's a crazy requirement. I mean, it's a real inhibitor to, if we're really going to foster this type of thing. But you glossed over, Mr. Facette, the minimum lot width. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet. I'm still going to be looking forward to more discussion about the minimum lot width requirement and how close these ADUs might be to an adjacent property, especially in more dense areas of the county. Thanks.
Okay, any other concerns or questions about the time requirement? Okay. Annual countywide limit, and this is the one where it's a 28. I noticed that you're not recommending to change that. This was one that I think at the very end 9 years ago, I think I proposed, and it was only because we had a lot of turmoil in the community about moving forward with an ADU proposal at all. And after looking at other communities, 28 was about the average that some of those like us, were able to accomplish. So to quell the angst that we were going to have 200 in the first year, we set a limit of the average of what other communities successfully were able to accomplish. And of course, we came nowhere near that. So, I don't feel very strongly. I think if we got 28 a year, we'd be in good shape. On the other hand, I don't particularly see a need to have a limit at 28, and I really open it up to my colleagues to comment. Mr. Dorsey?
Yeah, I will just say, this is really great work that everyone has done, but this is not anything that I can stomach or support at all. I think and the data that you provided just really reinforces that. One, if we think this is a good policy, putting a cap on it, to me, sends a very different message. Two, even at the likely installation rates, we're not talking about a big impact on our community. And who's to say that if we get 29, if the 29th application is really like the ideal textbook, accessory dwelling location and circumstance, we have to say no because we're going to cap it? I'm sorry. I want to be open to giving you the chance to explain it, but it just really seems insane.
All right, let's go to Ms. Garvey. You had your light on?
I was just going to say, ask Mr. Dorsey if he'd be comfortable with a higher cap, and I'm thinking that eventually we would remove it, but I do think we will run into people really concerned about what's going to happen, and that it might be a way of reassuring people, but we could also wait and see what kind of feedback we get from the community when we go into it.
If I could just add some context about the conversation, because the staff proposal that came to me had no limit, and I looked around the room. No, this is me. I looked around the room and I did a survey of everybody who was here 9 years ago who was still suffering from shell shock. And I said, what do you think? And the consensus of the grizzled veterans in the room was we could kill the entire conversation by not having some sort of limit. And then we said, okay, well, what limit makes sense? And we said, we don't know. We don't think 28 is a magic number. There should be some limit. So we said, let's bring it to the county board and see, in their wisdom, what they would come up with. So.
All right, so how about 50?
And I'll just focus people on slide 16, which was in the presentation, which is the only information that kind of relates to this, is how many have been approved as, quote, installation rate. And you go from 135 averaging a year in Portland in recent years to 50 to 20 to 2 or 3 for us. So again, just a smattering of 4 localities. But Mr. Weistad and then Ms. Crystal.
Thank you. So I do think that the 28, frankly, it's too low. I mean, I am open to having a cap of some sort. I think Ms. Garvey is right in terms of ensuring that our single-family neighborhoods are protected and that their integrity is maintained. We just don't know. I mean, we're really plowing new ground here, and yes, we can look at what other communities have done, but I don't think we know enough yet to say what limit is appropriate, maybe not even to say whether a limit is appropriate, but I at least at this point, I'm not in favor of removing it altogether. I think a higher cap deserves some discussion.
Go, Ms. Crystal.
I don't necessarily have an answer to this question of cap or no cap, but I will say in terms of how I'm looking at it, at least, what would be, the only reason I would consider a cap, or the only reason I want to think about it is, what are the impact of these at scale in neighborhoods, or at a significant scale in neighborhoods? It's sort of why I brought up the student generation factor, right? Or certainly, off-street parking, or on-street parking. Or sort of other things like this. So what's the number at which this actually really starts to have an impact on kind of ways of life in the community? Right now we are so far with 20 in a decade from actually having an impact on any of those sort of, public accommodations that it almost seems laughable. But I guess if we would like to signal to the community that we are mindful that these could at scale have an impact, that might be where the cap question enters in, at least.
Could I ask staff a question about this? Would it be at all workable, not today necessarily, but to consider a cap in terms of numbers within civic association boundaries, or considering the geography of things? Now, of course, the thing is, we don't know who's going to be applying. We don't know how these units might be clustered. So I'm just wondering if there might be any sort of geographical component to what we might consider. Is that workable from a legal perspective?
There are some ordinance that limit it that way. They do a minimum feet from the next accessory dwelling that's been approved. So if you're within, 500 feet with an accessory dwelling, you can't create an accessory dwelling. So some have limited that way. I haven't seen any that have limited specifically based on geographic areas, but I'm not sure if the...
You said Mr. McIsaac is here, Mr. Schwartz?
He's in the house.
Does Mr. McIsaac have any quick quip?
We have all these people listening,
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that's a viable approach. I think we'd want to articulate the rationale behind how we're trying to geographically disperse them or whatever. It's grounded in certain land use principles that we can come up with, but it gives you an ability to kind of control how many are going to be in a particular area, because again, I think the underlying premise is you don't want to change the character of the neighborhood to such a degree that you end up imposing all kinds of impacts on the single-family homes in the area.
Do you think you could tie it to zoning district, or zoning classification?
Yeah, I don't know that that would be sufficient, quite honestly, because you could still get really adverse consequences if you allowed them in a particular zoning district.
Because the zoning districts are in such a checkerboard
No, it's
pattern?
just-
I mean, that's not true in all areas of the county.
Right, but if you did it in just the R6 district, I mean, you could end up with 10 of them on the same street, which could
Right.
really be unfortunate. But I think we could look at some options as to how to limit it. And
So, Mr. Fazette, have we with our colloquy given de facto guidance to the manager to look at this?
Let's actually talk, just
We haven't
decide
finished the
what that
discussion.
is.
You just had the
Mr.
last word on this one.
Yeah, Mr. Dorsey, did you have a comment on this?
Yes, I do. In case I wasn't clear about it. So, I mean, I think Mr. Weistat speaks more to what is the concern it seems that a limit is trying to address, is saturating it in a particular area where it's not necessarily well thought out. So that's certainly better than an overall number, in my opinion. But to me, there are a couple of other approaches that seem to be better. If we're so unsure as to whether or not this is right and this will have a good or a positive or negative impact on neighborhoods, then maybe a better approach is to target a certain number that we're going to allow, and then we'll revisit the program. This whole idea of an annual cap, to me, just seems really arbitrary and capricious. Just because, you know, if you get 50 that are well dispersed throughout the county, why in the world should you prevent the 51st? Yet if you get 20 that are concentrated in Barcroft or Waycroft Woodlawn, you may in fact have a problem. So to me, if we're still in the experimental phase of this, we're still trying to gather data, how about, set a number that we're going to allow ourselves to approve, and then once we hit that number, we're going to reassess where we are at the program based on the data that we have collected, if this is still a concern. I have to be honest, I don't think it's a concern. I think we should let the market do what it does, and it'll be fine, but
Mr. Dorsey, can I try to understand what you said? You've said you don't like the idea of a cap, but you might like the idea of some temporary, a threshold at which there's a stop and look back.
It's sort of like the
Little
idea
bit
of it
different.
being a
Could
pilot,
I
I
ask people
think.
to look at slide 11, only because that's the one in here that talks about where the 20 are? And I do think that this conversation is in fact a solution searching for a problem. And I would also say that the idea that some localities have a 500-foot limit from the next ADU sounds like a terrible idea to me. I don't know what jurisdictions, and I'm glad, we know that other jurisdictions have different ways of trying to address what are seen as potential concerns. That, to me, is really problematic. Then you have a big R20 lot, which is never going to fall into that category, but several in another neighborhood where they really want it because their neighbor has one, they can never have one. I just think it's a bad idea. Built into the ordinance should be those realities and protections and mitigations for the reality of having an ADU in your neighborhood. If there's not enough parking, you won't be granted a permit, for example. There are protections built in. You can't have one with 6 people. You can't have one. That's why we put these other limits on the ADUs in the ordinance that ensures that you don't have too much negative impact. Granted, there's a difference in an R5 neighborhood than an R20, but the worst solution to this is the idea of feet apart. The idea of making sure you don't have too many in one area, I'm a little nervous about that too. I think I'm most comfortable with what Mr. Dorsey's recommended, is that we have a look back to see what the implications are, so that if there is a developing concern that we weren't able to predict, that we have an ability to assess it.
Yeah, Mr. Facette, I really like that idea. It feels more like a pilot program to some extent, and I think, I don't think we're going to have a problem. None of us do, but I think when this goes out to our community, listening to Mr. Schwartz's memories, and mine are very vague because I wasn't near the county board at the time, but I did kind of watch it from afar. I think people may have a lot of concerns, and this may really help make people more comfortable with it, and I think that's part of our job here.
What Christian mentioned.
Yes, what Christian
Okay,
suggested.
so
If we could just be clear, I personally believe that we ought to do this because there's good work that informs it. It's the right way to move forward. If we found out that it wasn't, we could always stop it. But however, if it's a way of getting that buy-in, I think this is a better approach than annual caps.
right.
And if I
So,
I
yeah,
could add,
please, John.
when we talked about, proposing the annual limit, we also talked about doing a more robust annual survey that would, identify, within these changes are more accessory dwellings coming in because of them.
Right.
Maybe more of a survey to the ones that have been created so that, we know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, I like the idea of not an annual limit, but a number, and then whenever we hit that number, we look at it. That might make you guys blanch because it might be sooner rather than later, but I prefer that.
So I think, Mr. Weisstat, we are moving in a slightly different direction, but there is some work to come back maybe with that, as Ms. Garvey and Mr. Dorsey just described.
I don't disagree with what Mr. Dorsey is suggesting we look at. It's just that now that the county attorney has said that there would be a possibility for some sort of geographic approach to this, I may have some follow-up questions in that regard. Thank you.
McIsaac is always there to tell us what we have the authority to do. He's not telling us what we should do, but he's telling us, which is his role, right? He's telling us what we have the authority to do or not do, correct? Yeah, just say yes.
I think Mr. Castile had something he wanted to say.
David?
No, so I guess it's an aspirational number, and I think what Joel was trying to say was that we do have an annual report, and so the alternative would be to go back to where we came from, is that we wouldn't have a cap, but we'd simply on an annual basis, we would monitor this, and so a year out from now, we're going to know whether we've got 5 more or 15 more or 150 or more. So I don't think we're going to get to 150, but at least if we do this on an annual basis, this will be a way to gauge where we are.
Yep. Okay, that's fine. And I think that everybody feels pretty good about that direction. So let's move on. A couple of people mentioned the idea of the deed covenant, the issues with the deed covenant, and then sort of tied to the issue that Mr. Weisstat raised about what shows up on our real estate records, right?
So can I just
Katie,
ask a
do you want to
question
frame
about
that question?
The recording or the recordation on the deed covenant specifically? So could you repeat again, knowing that, I think we've heard from a few, at least instances, if not, just in the general conversation, that actually this could be a real burden, having it recorded on the deed, in terms of financing, mortgaging, et cetera. So can you just repeat for us again why it matters or why we would like to continue to require it?
So the deed covenant was put there, and it is considered a best practice with other jurisdictions, and most others require a deed covenant. And what it does is it alerts the new homeowner that they have a legal accessory dwelling in their property and that they need to follow the requirements that are in place in the zoning. So it actually, the big thing is that it alerts the new owner that there is an accessory dwelling there.
Is there an option for us to Mr. Weisstat's question, is there a way we can alert the new owner without adding it to the deed?
The purchaser, a prospective purchaser.
Correct, right? I mean, I think this is, and the, Ms. Hogan or others with the working group can correct me if this perception is wrong, but I am under the understanding that this is actually a really significant obstacle. And so that's why I asked.
To what?
To the creation of an accessory dwelling. So individuals are interested in doing this, and they find that it is going to make the financing a lot harder, their mortgage considerably more expensive, et cetera.
I mean, speak to that. Did this
that's not
surface as
correct?
an obstacle?
It did, and we have heard from one person, Ken Augenbaugh, that has brought this up, and he has written to you on this issue. And the issue is in high-cost areas where you would have to get a bigger loan, a balloon mortgage. Jumbo, sorry. Balloon jumbo. Jumbo mortgage.
Big balloon.
So,
Dirigible mortgage.
yeah. So,
Okay.
and part of the issue too is that he's saying that if you go to closing and then this shows up on your your deed, that can definitely affect what type of financing you get, and that's very much at the last minute of, when things are happening. So it doesn't necessarily affect the construction of an accessory dwelling, but it could have unintended consequences for the future buyer.
Can you, again, explain that? Because my own expectation would have been that having an accessory dwelling allows you to qualify for a higher loan because there's a revenue stream.
Correct. And we have not been able to verify that, this is correct, what I've been saying. We've reached out to other jurisdictions, and the jurisdictions we've talked to have not had the similar issue. I did reach out to Fairfax. I haven't heard back yet, since they are also a Virginia locality, and to see if they have any issues with this. The banks that have been reached out to have been reluctant to answer until they actually know if they're actually going through the process. So I think it's still unknown.
Okay, can I turn to Mr. Vice?
Done there.
I think a couple things. Number one, it might be helpful for us to reach out to the Mortgage Bankers Association and maybe the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors to get their insights on this kind of financing dynamic. But the other thing is, okay, so we record a restrictive covenant or a deed covenant for notice in the ADU context, but do we do that in the in the homestay context or in the family caregivers suite context? And if not, why not? Is there a rational basis for a distinction among the three on that point?
The family caregiver does require a deed on the covenant as well.
Okay.
But as far as I know, the short term is just a business homestay license, I believe. Business.
Doesn't require much, physical change of your space, right?
Well, I thought what Mr. Weishaupt was going to ask is, you were asking earlier, is there some way on the assessment, for example, that we could
Right, some sort of code on the assessments which is available to the public, the lawyers see it, the lending officers see it, the realtors see it.
But it's not on the deed.
That was
Yeah.
my question.
So right now, is there anything on the real estate documents or the county provides?
I do not believe so. I'd have to check on that.
Look into that, because I think we've heard this in a couple of other instances with the different, whether you're in the RPA, et cetera. It seems like there's a value. Now, it doesn't mean you're using it or you're renting it. It means that it is legally been created. But it seems to have some value. And again, it seems like worth exploring and trying to assess whether there is value in terms of providing that additional information.
And we did reach out to the assessor's office and ask them Mr. Vice's question regarding how are these appraised?
Right.
And what the time lag is for that.
Right.
Are assessed. So they are assessed based on their improvements. So, if they're adding a kitchen, that gets added to the assessed value. And they're usually caught somewhat soon when the permit is done, when the construction is done. And if not, then it's usually in the calendar year, so it is within that time frame.
So, Mr. Vice.
So for example, assuming a person pulls a permit, which they're supposed to do, that's logged into the county system, and then there's a certificate of occupancy issued, presumably after the work is done, and then so that would be registered with our assessor's office, and that presumably increased value would kick in for the next assessment year, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Christian?
Yeah, I just sort of, I think I'm along the same lines, just being somewhat concerned at the instrument of a deed covenant, not knowing exactly how we can finesse it, that might sort of create questions about a use that is not in use. So, it can be a garage that would otherwise not be a concern for a lender, or it could be a place that is part of our approved ADU program, but that could change at any point over the life of someone having a loan. Yet there's this covenant which requires some degree of legal involvement and some cost to change if you should ever change the use. It just seems like a blunt instrument for what we're trying to overall create, and that is flexibility in how to use your property to meet goals. So I would just love to see further work on that.
I am happy to have some more analysis of this. I mean, My gut tells me, because we actually purchased a home that had a mother-in-law suite, is what we were told, but we were told when we purchased it, you could rent it. We had no idea. So the information that's provided to me on a deed is a value about what actually you are buying and what you're not, and therefore what you're able to do with it legally and what you're not. I think I'll go back and read Ken's letter, for example, but I have always assumed that if you had an ADU, that you then would qualify for a higher mortgage, because they see this as they allow that to be then counted as income when you qualify for a mortgage. So, but more than anything, it's about being clear about what you're buying as a purchaser, and a lot of people won't know the difference between these things. I would like to ask a question now about building code obstacles. What is the cost now? I would love to know what people assess to be the average cost to create an ADU, and then what the primary elements of that cost are. And I know Shahryar has been involved with that in looking at how to remove some of those barriers and costs.
So we've had numerous conversations about this, and the cost really varies on the creation of an accessory dwelling, ranges from $20,000 to $80,000. But you are correct, and one of the big drivers in that cost is the fire separation, the separate heating and air conditioning, and we can get you the range on those prices of what that costs. It's going to be new construction more than likely, or some kind of substantial renovation. So there is going to be the costs associated with that. Architect is probably going to need to be involved, electrician, so it all kind of adds up, and we can work on getting you a cost breakdown of that. As far as your other point, Shahryar Amiri had submitted some revisions to the state on how accessory dwellings should be treated. He submitted to the state that accessory dwellings should be treated as part of the main dwelling and should not be subject to fire, separate heating and air conditioning, and that was recommended for denial. So
by DHCD,
correct.
The department.
So it's not final yet, but it's looking like that's pretty much dead, and so
yeah,
that's where that is at.
Well, just for information's sake, and I think these are things that only can be handled by the state. From what I understand, they're in the state building code. But I also understand that if one of the things we're trying to do is remove obstacles where we can, like this 1 year, occupancy, that this is a place where some serious obstacles occur. And that's why the vast majority of ADUs in the county are not registered. They are not legal, and our goal is to make them legal so they meet the safety codes, and so forth. I would think it'd be helpful for us to get something of a summary of what those special costs related to the building code are, and what the costs, what the elements are, what the costs may be, just a general assessment, and what we've done, what steps we've taken, and what future steps we might take to try to remove some of those where we think it's okay to remove them or change them. Okay, other questions on this? John, did you have?
I have a broad question, not on this particular item.
Okay, if there are no more on this, go ahead, go to the next one.
So, the way this sprang, was through our affordable housing master plan. And what I'm wondering is, are we really talking just as much, if not more, about aging in place, intergenerational housing, that type of thing? Because there's certainly nothing that we've talked about today, and nothing that we're considering really ensures or mandates that we are expanding the supply of affordable housing. There's not, we're not imposing rent controls or mandates that somebody rent this unit to people of a certain income or asset class. or economic circumstance. You could be renting this to, the son or daughter of a wealthy family who's in town going to a private school, and can easily afford to live somewhere else or have a bigger place or whatever. So I just like folks' thoughts as to how this really helps housing affordability, and it may at the margins. It seems to me the bigger play here is that it affords greater opportunities for aging in place and intergenerational families. And I'm not sure that it makes a difference how you answer that question either way. It's just an interesting kind of maybe coffee conversation.
You're posing that to Alice?
Sure, and anybody else.
You're looking at me, so, okay. I think a theme that has been touched on many times this afternoon is that, this is kind of a second look at something we looked at about a decade ago, and there was a lot of backlash from the community. So I think these are sort of those baby steps trying to come back from a lot of restrictive, aspects of this ordinance that weren't necessary and got what some people wanted, which was almost no units. So now we're ready to relook at that. A decade has gone by. We have Airbnb, things have changed, and people are opening their minds. And so here we are kind of making our way back towards a reasonable ordinance. So I think, to your point, we didn't look at affordability per se and making these into CAFs or any of that yet. But by default, they will be about $1,000 a unit. So in effect, for some people, this will be market rate affordable. And so I think the idea that we'll look at many of these things again in 2 years, that certainly would be something to look at later. Would there be some sort of a pool that landlords could tap into to kind of supplement renting at a lower rate or something? We could figure out, could this be part of the housing grant program? Could this be, there are many things that we could elaborate on later. I don't think we're going there yet, and I think that's potential, especially depending on volume. So we have to wait and see, I think.
Good response, Alice. Nice job.
Well, it's very, very.
No, I'm all about affordability.
I know, very
That's why you were looking
provocative. Right, thank you. Thank you.
Could I add one?
Libby
Yeah.
and then Katie.
It seems to me there are two ways it actually helps affordability. One is the one Ms. Hogan outlined. I mean, it's a small space, $1,000. Yes, maybe somebody who really doesn't need it could be, but in general, people who have a whole lot of money don't live in small spaces and they get their, anyway, I think it allows the market to supply it. The other thing it does, I think, is it helps make home ownership more affordable because people can buy a home and they've got $1,000 extra on the mortgage. And so I think it does both things, both home ownership and rental, which makes it really great. I hope we get a lot of them and everybody's happy with them. We'll see.
Katie.
Yeah, and I appreciate Ms. Garvey's comments as well as Ms. Hogan's. I think that's exactly right. And I actually came into this work session prepared to ask a few questions about, how we might be potentially setting incentives, et cetera. And then you all came in with that really remarkable statistic, right, about where the market is supplying these. And I actually think this is really indicative of a broader issue in our community, which is diversity of housing forms is such an important element of our overall affordability picture. Right now we really just have kind of one way of tackling our affordability challenge, and that's through density, right? And so thinking about, ways to look at whether it's micro units in Crystal City or accessory dwellings in our single-family housing, being able to see that picture more robustly, even if it includes some people paying less in rent than they might otherwise be able to afford. It's the different types of housing that will create a more complete picture for us. So with that said, I just really wanted to give commendations to the work group and the staff. I think this is something a lot of us have been excited about for a long time and is in fact maybe just one step on our journey towards talking about missing middle housing forms more broadly. And I'm just really pleased that this conversation is now underway.
Were there any other issues we wanted to surface? I have only one. I don't see anything else. And that's just in looking at the table on page 16 and what some of the other cities have done, I noticed that waived system development charges. And one of my questions is whether or not we looked at, in light of some of those building code requirements and costs, did we look at any potential of waiving various fees that we otherwise wouldn't in order to incentivize ADUs?
So the permit for an accessory dwelling, I believe, is only $209. So waiving that is probably not a huge incentive. I could I'm not sure what else is really charged
I
for
get-
that. I mean,
I don't know the answer either, and that's part of why I'm asking, but, you know, you mentioned separate heating and cooling, you mentioned fire, particularly design around fire and ingress egress maybe. To the degree there are specific permits that would be required because it is an ADU, I would ask that you know, if people are comfortable, just look at that, see if there makes any sense to find one that's so specific, you know, that could be attached to an ADU, that could be waived or reduced. And I say that partly because, you know, Shahryar, I believe, has gotten to the place where he sees that some of these requirements in the building code are onerous, and that he would be comfortable if some of them were modified, and we're now hearing the state is unlikely to do that. So on the flip side, there's a cost to some of those. Is there a way to reduce some of the cost burden for the implementation of some of those code changes? That's kind of what I'd ask that we look at, if you haven't already. Don't know what might come out the other end, but it seems like it's worth exploring if the goal is to reduce some of the obstacles.
Mr. Fasette?
Katie and then Libby?
I want to make sure I'm tracking what you're suggesting. So if, for example, the building code requires there to be installation of, fire retardant materials, and that costs $5,000, what is it that Arlington County would be in a position to waive there?
Well, if there's a permit fee for, if there's a permit fee required for,
I guess the only thing I would hesitate is if I think about this in context of, when we talked about the short-term home occupancy, if there is a cost to staff to administer these things, and if that's a mere fraction of the overall cost, I worry that we could be waiving that, imposing costs for us to find elsewhere in our operating budget without actually really reducing the disincentive.
This is generating revenue, too.
I was,
If they're out there.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really ask with a predetermined expectation of what comes out the other end. But as I was looking at this list and I saw Portland waived some system fees, some development charges. Now, those were different. I understand what those were. Those were fees for sort of mitigation of impacts, of almost like impact fees. But I come back to, when you're looking at promoting, incentivizing solar, there are things you do sometimes with your permit costs to reduce that administrative cost, that permit fee. Are there any that could be attached to ADUs that would help incentivize and overcome some of it truly is a cost. I mean, we've heard that to many it's $60,000 or $70,000 to create an ADU legally, and they end up going ahead and creating it without doing it legally, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
I was kibitzing with Mr. Lawson there, who sent us the email about, and he thinks that in Fairfax, they make some definitional changes that make it, then the code doesn't apply, sort of changing on how they define things. So I think he's going to look at that, and I'm sure the staff may be aware of it already. I don't know if that's the case or not, but apparently there are some ways around things.
Mr. Dorsey?
I would certainly encourage Mr. Fasette, seconding your desire to take a look at it. I would think with new construction, it's not really going to make a difference. However, for the purposes of existing construction, maybe we could think about, well, for the next year, there are no Arlington County permit fees associated with this, or 6 months, assuming that anything that's already as built to ADU specifications, that will then be an inducement for people to actually bring it in and register it as legal, because they don't have to pay any fees for something that they've already built and spent the money on. So maybe there's, a different way of looking at it, how to encourage people to, come out and make theirs legit versus, throwing away money that we should rightly receive when people are spending thousands on creating one.
All right, okay, I think we're all done. Thank you. I'm going to just echo what my colleagues have said. Thank you for some great working group work and staff work, and we'll look forward to getting this back in advertisement in October and adoption in November. And if for any reason you feel like you're off that timeline, like you want to come early, let us know.
I had one more thing I wanted to add.
Alice, what was
Sorry.
that?
One of the things that I was interested in, and we discussed in the working group that didn't come up, was the idea of, this idea, A, of bringing people into compliance who are already out there, and B, incentivizing new ones. One of the things we heard from people who came and testified was that the process in the zoning office is tricky, and that different times you go in, you get different answers because it's so unusual to do this, and there's no expert. No one in that office knows exactly how to implement this ordinance. And now we'll have new regulations, and I think that will remain the case. So that's changing. One of the things that we had talked about was the idea of having one person in that office to shepherd people through this process. Because we don't expect there to be 500 applications, would it be feasible to have someone who is the expert?
Alice,
That could be you?
Alice, thank you for raising it. I'm glad you all talked about it, and I think when this comes back in the board report that we advertise, it will be helpful to address that question, which is really the administrative carrying out of this function within the permitting office and all. So it'll be a good thing to get some more information from staff on. Okay, thank you very much. We are returning for a work session at 7 p.m., but in the interim, we are adjourned. So at some event recently.